My name is Christy Manuel, and my topic was environmental considerations of dietary formulation and feeding. The three main environmental considerations when feeding equines are the nutrients and the effect on the water systems, particularly for phosphorus and nitrogen, pasture management and the effect on soil erosion, and the environmental effects of equine grazing. The first nutrient I want to discuss is phosphorus. The calcium-phosphorus ratio should be about 2:1. Since phosphorus decreases the absorption of calcium, it's recommended to feed more calcium than phosphorus in the diet. However, the calcium-phosphorus ratio of alfalfa hay and other legumes that equines eat is higher than 2:1, and the ratio can be as high as 6:1 or 8:1. So some nutritionists believe adding phosphorus above the requirement should be supplemented to horses' diets. For the horses, they're eating alfalfa hay. But the high phosphorus levels in the horse's diet can be harmful to the environment when they're excreted out. An important nutrient to consider when discussing environmental considerations of equine diets is phosphorus. The main goal of phosphorus is to transfer energy. Phosphorus is essential for plant growth, but mismanagement of phosphorus in the soil can become a threat to the water quality through runoff. So when the lakes and rivers are polluted with phosphorus, a lot of algae will start to grow, which reduces the water quality, and it's harmful to the fish populations. And this is a diagram of the phosphorus cycle. And phosphorus exists as phosphate when it's in soil and water, and phosphate is taken up by the plants through the soil. The horse eats the plants, and the phosphates return to the soil as the organic residues decay in the soil. Phosphate can be lost through the soil erosion and into the water runoff. In a study by Lavin in 2014, looked at the effects of supplementing phytase to equine diets, and this was due to the concern of the phosphorus runoff into the environment, and the study was to determine how well the horses digest phosphorus. So there have been several other studies with phytase supplementation in swine and poultry diets, and they digest it very well, so they don't need as much of the phosphorus supplements as horses. So less phosphorus ends up in the environment. So this study was on 6 Arabian horses, fed 3 diets. There was a control, which was just a concentrate and a hay, a high phosphorus concentrate and a hay diet, and a forage only diet. And all of these were phytase supplemented and non-phytase supplemented. So there was a total of 6 diets altogether. The results of this study indicate that mature horses are able to maintain a near zero phosphorus balance with adequate phosphorus in the diet, even if it's in the diet as phytate. And also the increased phosphorus intakes above the requirement may result in increased potentially detrimental outputs to the environment. So if you are supplementing too much phosphorus in the diet, it will have an impact on the environment. So they found that through analyzing the feed and the feces, that horses actually are capable of degrading the phytate, and that the phytase supplementation was not beneficial to the horse, and it was actually detrimental to the environment. This was a study looking at the impact of feeding excess nitrogen or protein in the horse's diet. This was by Woodward in 2011, and the study was looking at the protein quality and the post-gut nitrogen utilization of several different diets, including Timothy hay, oat supplemented Timothy hay diets, alfalfa hay, and The nitrogen digestibility was measured, as well as the urinary excretion of nitrogen, and they also did some blood work profiles in Arabian horses. The results were that the alfalfa nitrogen digestibility increased with the decreasing harvest maturity, but nitrogen retention did not change. And also the urinary volume and nitrogen excretion increased, indicating post-absorptive nitrogen utilization actually decreased. So knowing the feed ingredient protein quality and the post-cut nitrogen utilization is important for successful horse feeding strategies, so you know the protein that's going in, what the horse is actually able to use and digest, and how much is coming out into the environment. The Woodward study on nitrogen losses and the effect on the environment used amino acids and fiber composition of the different forages to evaluate the factors that could affect the protein quality. So they determined that oats at the 0.2% or 0.4% of body weight compared to the Timothy hay had an enhanced nitrogen digestibility without increasing nitrogen excretion. So this indicates improvement in the post-gut nitrogen utilization. They also determined feeding alfalfa of decreased maturity had an increase in the urine volume and decreased post-gut nitrogen utilization. And also that the urinary volume, urinary nitrogen excretion, and total nitrogen excretion were increased in horses that were fed alfalfa compared to the horses that were fed the Timothy hay and the oat supplemented Timothy hay. So they concluded that feeding the oat supplemented Timothy hay is more environmentally sustainable than feeding alfalfa to the horse at maintenance or in light or moderate exercise levels. And so basically the grass hay is more environmentally desirable than the legume hay. However, more research is needed to determine the impact of feeding forages such as Timothy and alfalfa hays and their impact on total nitrogen losses to the environment. A study by Parveg in 2015 looked at the amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen that are deposited into the soil. So in Sweden, they looked at 7 horse farms and compared different areas of a horse paddock. So they looked at the feeding area, the grazing area, the excretion area of the paddock, and compared it to an unmanaged soil. And they looked at the levels of phosphorus and nitrogen in these different areas. So the results show that the concentration of phosphorus and nitrogen were highest in the feeding and excretion areas of these paddocks. And so that means these sections of the paddocks for the feeding and where the excretion areas are had the highest risk of the phosphorus leaching out into the environment. So there are 3 main points to look at for the effect of the equine grazing on the pasture quality and the effect on the environment. The first one is the time spent grazing. So some horses are periodic grazers and they need the frequent small meals, and also the time of day, the daytime versus nighttime feeding. The preference and the palatability of the pasture. This will include the plant species, the nutrients, the maturity of the forage, whether the pasture is legumes versus grasses. The palatability is based on the available plants and the environment of the plants, and the plant maturity is important, and for example, the more mature the plants are, the less palatable they probably are. And the persistence and yield of the forage, the idea is to maximize the yield of the pasture. So the species selection is based on the persistence of the horses grazing and the yield of the pasture. So grasses that persist under the horse grazing conditions should be selected to have a maximum yield, maximum dry matter, calories, and nutrients that will be available to the horse. And also additional research is needed to identify maximum yielding pasture species and mixtures of different grasses and legumes, and which ones are specific to different geographical regions. So there are several benefits of pasture to the horse. Well-managed pastures can help meet the horse's daily nutrient requirements for energy and protein. There's several vitamins and minerals such as calcium, phosphorus, selenium. However, the pasture lacks sodium, chloride, copper, and zinc, which is why it's recommended to supplement these minerals, trace minerals, or the salts into the horse's diet. And pasture is also a great source of the fat-soluble vitamins for vitamins E and A, and also a source of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So there's also benefits of the pasture to the environment. So when the horses spend time on the paddocks, their manure provides a source of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for the plants, which can help decrease the time and cost of fertilizers and reduce labor, as well as fossil fuels, and helps improve air quality. So the vegetative cover of the pasture helps maintain the water quality and helps reduce soil erosion and runoff nutrients. And it was determined that this the vegetative cover should be greater than 70%, should be plants. And pasture decreases greenhouse gas emissions as well. However, more research regarding equine-specific practices for farms needs to be implemented to help evaluate pastures quantitatively and correctly. In a study by Bott in 2013, the environmental impacts of grazing horses were examined, and there are 4 main areas where horses can have an environmental impact. They include the vegetative damage, trampling, soil damage and erosion, and defecation. So with the first one, vegetative damage, that is all depending on the time grazing and if it's in a restricted area, the climate, the soil fertility, and it really depends if the horses are selective grazers. And also the nutrient loss from erosion impacts the vegetative damage if that vegetative canopy is less than 70%. So trampling is the second environmental impact caused by grazing horses. Horses generally graze in a forward motion, and grazing impacts the pasture by removing forage with the hoof traffic, and it also compacts the soil. So the plant species that are in the pasture determines how well they'll regenerate from this trampling. Also, dry conditions and overgrazed pasture reduces the organic matter. So there could be decreased water or nutrient availability, which reduces the plant health, and then that's what the horse is eating. And also there's more runoff and erosion without the plant root systems that are established. So the high traffic areas of the pasture have more surface runoff and a high risk for increasing the phosphorus that travels to the nearby water sources and contaminates the water. So the horse grazing can affect the biomass and organic matter of the soil, and horses have a greater pressure in pound force per square inch with their large body mass. So that's what causes the biomass reduction, and the pressure from the hooves and the heavy weight onto the soil reduces the space between particles, causing soil compaction, which is a huge problem, and that's what affects the plant growth. Soil damage and erosion has an impact on vegetation growth. So the horses can damage soil in 3 ways, with compaction, pugging, or poaching. And the compaction is the large weight with the small hooves. It increases the surface water runoff, reduces the plant health. The pugging is when the pasture is uneven, has an uneven surface, and there's not a whole lot of moisture in the soil at the time, so it'll decrease the water that can go to the soil to the plants, which inhibits the plant growth. And poaching is when the horses stand in saturated areas where the soils can't properly drain extra water, so the hooves allow more water back into the soil by standing in it. So the soil erosion occurs with a lack of forage and with a lot of rain and standing water. So this results in overgrazing and overstocking, and it affects the soil nitrogen concentration and it increases, and this also affects the growth of the vegetation. So the soil, this is so important because the soil supplies the nutrition to the vegetation and therefore to the horses. Defecation is also an environmental impact from grazing horses. These horses can graze in these lawn areas and then they relocate to defecate. So the lawn areas will have all the nutrients and the plants, and then there's the rough areas that they go to for their elimination and defecation. And with the defecation though, it can bring parasites out into the pasture. The pastures contaminated with the feces have higher levels of potassium. Phosphorus and potassium concentrations can vary in the pastures based on the stocking density. However, we need more research for the manure and pasture management. So the horse manure also has bacteria, which can be a threat to humans in our water. So this also goes with the whole runoff and the soil erosion too, if that bacteria runs into the water. And so it's just really important to manage the land and have healthy soil and vegetation, but also remove the manure and the runoff from the actual horse farm. So for pasture management, there's grazing systems that can impact the environment. There's not as much research on equine grazing systems as there are for ruminant, but there are the two basic systems where you have continuous and you have rotational. Continuous is where the horses graze in one pasture without resting periods. There's a nutrient overload in areas due to scattered defecation, and there's excessive phosphorus that can be the problem. So for example, if you have a 500 kilogram horse that excretes 25 kgs per day of feces and urine, would have an output of 0.13% phosphorus on average. And for the rotational grazing system, this is when the horses are moved from one pasture to another so the forage can rest and regrow, which helps maximize the production and yield. And the horses aren't overly selective, so the grazing is more uniform. It is recommended for current management practices to use these general guidelines to maintain a high vegetative cover for optimal production. So going back to having a greater than 70% vegetative cover, fertilization for at least one macronutrient, so either nitrogen, phosphorus, and or potassium was necessary for optimal production. Rotational grazing is recommended because it maximizes pasture recovery and utilization. And the grazing systems with the sacrifice lot for the high traffic, that can help with the mud and the standing water and reduce the runoff through the manure and waste to the waters. So in summary, phosphorus and nitrogen excretions from the horse can negatively affect the soil, the plants, the vegetation, and the water sources in an area after the horse grazes. Equine environmental impacts include the selective grazing, soil erosion, manure management, and trampling. And really we need more research on pasture management and grazing specific to the horse rather than the ruminant, as well as more research on specific nutrients being excreted. There seems to be more with ruminants, swine, and poultry than horses. So definitely more research is needed to get more accurate data.